The bride's veil slipped mid-ceremony. What her mother saw underneath still haunts the family. They say every wedding carries two vows, one between lovers and one between the living and the dead. On a quiet Saturday morning in Enugu, Nigeria, the veil slipped during the ceremony, and what her mother saw underneath changed everything. This is not a ghost story. This is not folklore passed down through generations. This is something that happened 2 years ago in a modern church filled with 300 witnesses, captured on video that was deleted within hours, investigated by police who found nothing, and whispered about in a community that still refuses to say the bride's name out loud. What you're about to hear will make you question everything you think you know about the thin line between this world and whatever lies beyond it. A bride who vanished before her honeymoon. A mother who refuses to speak about what she saw that day, who sits in her house in Enugu with the curtains drawn and won't attend another wedding. And a community that believes the ceremony wasn't a marriage at all, but something else entirely, something ancient that borrowed the face of the living. Who was the bride really marrying that day in front of all those people? What was hiding beneath that white lace veil imported from South Africa? And why did the priest who performed the ceremony disappear 2 days later, resigning from a position he'd held for 15 years without explanation, leaving only a handwritten note that said, "I cannot unsee what I have seen"? Before we go deeper into this mystery, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Let me introduce you to the people at the center of this story. Adaeze Okonkwo was 28 years old, the first daughter in a devout Christian family from Enugu. Her mother, Mrs. Chioma Okonkwo, had raised her 3 children alone after her husband died in a car accident when Adaeze was 15. Mrs. Chioma was known in their community as a deeply spiritual woman, the kind who prayed for hours before dawn, who had vivid dreams that sometimes came true, who could look at a person and sense things others couldn't see. Adaeze had grown up beautiful and ambitious, studied accounting at the University of Nigeria in Nsukka, worked for a consulting firm in Enugu, owned her own car, paid her own rent. She was independent, modern, the kind of Nigerian woman who balanced tradition with progress. Then she met Tobena Chukwudi at a business conference in Abuja. Tobena was 32, charming in that effortless way that made everyone in a room turn when he spoke. He claimed to be an entrepreneur who just returned from 10 years abroad, splitting time between London and Dubai, now ready to invest in Nigeria's future. He wore expensive watches, drove a new Mercedes, spoke with a slight British accent that could have been real or affected. Nobody was quite sure. Their courtship was intense and fast. 6 months from meeting to engagement. Adaeze was swept up in it, posting photos on Instagram with captions like, "God's timing is perfect, and finally found my king." Her friends were envious. Her mother was concerned. Mrs. Chioma told her daughter multiple times that something felt wrong about Tobena, that when she looked at him, she felt cold, despite the Lagos heat, that in her dreams, she kept seeing a faceless man standing at an altar. But Adaeze, like so many women in love, dismissed her mother's concerns as old-fashioned superstition, as a widow's fear of losing her daughter, as the generation gap between traditional beliefs and modern romance. She told her mother that not everything was spiritual warfare, that sometimes a good thing was just a good thing, that she was tired of being single while all her friends got married. The wedding was planned for April 14th at the Crystal Cathedral in Enugu, a massive church that seated 1,000 people. No expense was spared. Tobena paid for everything, insisted on it, said his bride deserved the best. The wedding dress alone cost over 2 million naira, imported Italian lace with a veil so long it required 3 flower girls to carry it. But there were small things, odd things that people noticed but didn't mention until later. Tobena had no family at the wedding. He claimed they were all abroad and couldn't make it, that his parents had died years ago, that he was essentially alone in the world, which made Adaeze's family even more special to him. His friends who attended, maybe 20 of them, were all people Adaeze had never met before. They were polite but distant, spoke in vague terms about how they knew Tobena, left immediately after the ceremony without staying for the reception. When Adaeze's uncle tried to do a traditional background check on Tobena's family, the kind that's customary before Igbo weddings, Tobena became defensive, said it was unnecessary, that he'd already paid the bride price, and what more did they need? The uncle backed down but remained suspicious. And then there were Mrs. Chioma's dreams, which got worse as the wedding approached. She dreamed of her daughter standing at an altar surrounded by mirrors, seeing 1,000 reflections, but none of them showing Adaeze's real face. She dreamed of a wedding dress walking by itself down an aisle in an empty church. She dreamed of white fabric turning to water, dissolving in her hands while voices she couldn't understand whispered in a language that sounded ancient and wrong. 3 days before the wedding, Mrs. Chioma begged her daughter to postpone, to wait, to give them time to learn more about Tobena. Adaeze refused. They had their worst argument ever, screaming things they'd never said to each other. Adaeze accused her mother of trying to sabotage her happiness out of jealousy. Mrs. Chioma said she'd rather lose her daughter's love than attend her funeral. In the end, Mrs. Chioma attended the wedding because what else could a mother do? But she went with a Bible in her bag and a prayer on her lips, and she sat in the front row watching everything with eyes that saw more than others could see. The wedding day, April 14th, dawned hot and clear, the kind of Enugu morning where the sun hits the red earth and makes everything look golden. Guests began arriving at the Crystal Cathedral around 8 in the morning, though the ceremony wasn't scheduled until 11. This was a society wedding, the kind where important people came to be seen, where photographers swarmed and Instagram stories multiplied, and everyone wanted to capture the perfect moment. The church was decorated like something from a magazine, white roses and orchids everywhere, purple ribbons because that was Adaize's favorite color, candles even though it was daytime, a red carpet running down the aisle, professional photographers and videographers positioned at every angle. The choir had been rehearsing for weeks, the pastor had written a special sermon about love and commitment, everything was choreographed to perfection. Adaize arrived at 10:30 in a white limousine with her bridesmaids. When she stepped out, people actually gasped. She looked stunning, absolutely radiant in that expensive dress with the long veil covering her face. But some people later said she looked too perfect, almost unreal, like a painting of a bride, rather than an actual person. Her makeup was flawless but heavy, much heavier than she usually wore. Her movements seemed slow, almost dreamlike, as if she was walking underwater. Mrs. Chioma was waiting at the church entrance. When she tried to hug her daughter, to have a private moment before the ceremony, Adaize pulled away. Not rudely, but firmly, like she was keeping distance. She spoke very little that morning, which people attributed to nerves, but her mother noticed something else. Adaize's voice sounded different, flatter, like she was reading from a script. The ceremony began on schedule. The church was packed, standing room only, with people crowding the doorways to catch a glimpse. Tubena stood at the altar in a black tuxedo, looking confident and handsome, smiling at guests who smiled back. The pastor began with prayers and readings. The choir sang beautifully. Everything proceeded normally until they reached the vows, the moment when the bride and groom face each other and speak the words that will bind them together. That's when it happened. Adaize was standing at the altar, Tubena holding her hands, the pastor reading from his Bible. The veil was still covering her face, which was traditional, meant to stay in place until after the vows, when the groom would lift it for the first kiss. But as the pastor said, "Do you, Adaize Okonkwo, take this man?" something shifted. Maybe it was a breeze from an open window, though later people said there was no breeze. Maybe it was the movement of her head, though she'd been standing perfectly still. Maybe it was something else entirely. The veil slipped, not dramatically, not falling to the ground, but sliding back just enough to reveal her face partially. And in that moment, in that split second before anyone could react, Mrs. Chioma saw her daughter's face. She was sitting in the front row, less than 3 meters away, with a perfect view. What she saw made her stand up involuntarily, her Bible falling from her hands and hitting the marble floor with a sound that echoed through the suddenly silent church. Because the face under that veil, the face that was supposed to be her daughter, wasn't quite right. The features were Adaize's. Yes, the same eyes and nose and mouth that Mrs. Chioma had looked at every day for 28 years. But something was wrong. The expression was vacant, empty, like a mask of her daughter, rather than her daughter herself. And the eyes, those were what made Mrs. Chioma's blood freeze. They were looking at nothing, focused on some point beyond this world, reflecting light in a way that human eyes shouldn't reflect light. Other people saw it too, though most couldn't articulate what was wrong. The guests in the front rows shifted uncomfortably. One of the bridesmaids later said she felt like she was going to vomit. A child in the audience started crying for no reason his parents could identify. The pastor stopped mid-sentence. His hand frozen in the air where he'd been gesturing, staring at the bride with an expression of confusion, mixed with something that might have been fear. For exactly 7 seconds, according to the video timestamp that was later analyzed, nobody moved. The whole church was frozen in that moment of wrongness, of reality, tilting slightly off its axis. Then, Tubena moved. He reached up quickly, almost too quickly, and pulled the veil back down over Adaize's face, covering whatever everyone had or hadn't seen. He said something, a joke about the veil being tricky, and some people laughed nervously, grateful for an excuse to break the tension. The pastor cleared his throat and continued with the ceremony, speaking faster now, rushing through the remaining vows as if he wanted this finished as quickly as possible. Mrs. Chioma tried to stop it. She called out her daughter's name, started to move toward the altar. But her brother, Adaize's uncle, grabbed her arm, pulled her back down to her seat, whispered urgently that she was causing a scene, that whatever she thought she saw could be dealt with later. So she sat down, trembling, tears running down her face, watching the rest of the ceremony through a fog of horror and helplessness. Adaize said her vows in that flat, strange voice. Tubena said his vows normally. The pastor pronounced them husband and wife. Tubena lifted the veil for the kiss, and this time everything looked normal. Adaize's face was her face again, smiling and beautiful. People applauded. The choir sang. The newly married couple walked back down the aisle waving at guests while photographers captured every moment. It should have been perfect. It should have been the happy ending to a love story. But then, as they reached the back of the church, as they were about to exit into the sunlight, every light in the building went out. The massive cathedral that had been bright with morning sun and electric lights suddenly plunged into complete darkness. Guests screamed. Children cried. In the confusion and darkness that lasted maybe 30 seconds, though it felt longer, people heard things. Whispers in languages they didn't recognize. The sound of fabric tearing. A woman's voice, whether it was Adayes or someone else nobody could say, speaking words that sounded like a warning, or a prayer, or a curse. When the lights came back on, Adayes and Tobena were gone. The confusion at the church was immediate and chaotic. Guests stumbled around in the restored light, looking for the bride and groom, assuming they'd just stepped outside or gone to the car. The photographers checked their cameras and found that the last several minutes of footage were corrupted, showing nothing but static and distorted images that looked like faces bleeding into each other. The videographer's equipment had completely shut off during those 30 seconds of darkness and wouldn't turn back on. By the time people made it outside, there was no sign of Adayes or Tobena. The white limousine that was supposed to take them to the reception was still parked where it had been. The driver confused about why they hadn't come out yet. Their belongings were in the church's preparation rooms. Adayes' phone still charging? Tobena's wallet still in his jacket pocket. Mrs. Chioma immediately knew something terrible had happened. She searched the church frantically, calling her daughter's name, checking every room, every corner, while other guests stood around whispering and checking their own phones for messages or updates. The pastor was found in his office, sitting at his desk, staring at nothing. When people asked him what happened, he wouldn't answer, just shook his head repeatedly and said he needed to pray. Within 2 hours, Mrs. Chioma had called the police. They arrived and treated it initially as a missing persons case, assuming the couple had simply left for some reason, maybe stage fright or last-minute doubts. But as the day wore on and there was still no contact, no sightings, nothing, the investigation became more serious. Detectives interviewed hundreds of guests. Most had seen nothing unusual, just a normal wedding that ended with a power outage. But the people in the front rows, those who'd seen the veil slip, they all described feeling something was wrong, though they struggled to articulate what. One woman said it felt like watching a puppet show where the strings were almost visible. A man said he'd had the overwhelming urge to run from the church, though he couldn't explain why. Adayes' bridesmaids were interviewed extensively. They all said that Adayes had seemed different that morning, quiet and distant, but they'd attributed it to wedding day nerves. One admitted that when she'd tried to talk to Adayes while they were getting ready, Adayes had looked right through her like she wasn't there, then blinked and suddenly seemed normal again. Tobena's friends, those 20 men who'd attended from his side, had all vanished. Police tried to track them down using the church's guest book and found that every single name and phone number they'd written was fake. The addresses were non-existent. It was as if they'd never existed at all. Investigators looked into Tobena's background, and that's when things got truly strange. The business he claimed to own had a website and social media presence, but no actual office. The address listed was a vacant lot in Lekki, Lagos. His business registration documents, which he'd shown Adayes and her family, were expertly forged. The bank accounts he'd used to pay for the wedding had been opened just 8 months earlier, with money whose origin couldn't be traced. Most disturbing of all, they couldn't find any record of Tobena Chukwudi existing before 2 years ago. No birth certificate, no school records, no passport, nothing. The man had appeared out of nowhere, built an entire false identity, and now had disappeared just as completely. Within days, the story had spread across Enugu and beyond. The media picked it up, initially treating it as a strange disappearance story, the kind that generates clicks and shares. But then the rumors started, the whispers that this was something else, something that had roots in older beliefs. Local people began talking about similar incidents from decades past, stories their grandparents had told about weddings that weren't really weddings, about spirits that borrowed human faces to complete unfinished business from the other side. An elderly woman came forward claiming that 50 years ago, her sister had vanished on her wedding day in similar circumstances, and the body was never found. Others shared stories of ceremonies that went wrong, of brides or grooms who seemed different on their wedding day, of vows that were actually contracts with forces that didn't belong in churches. The police didn't know what to do with these testimonies. They were trained to investigate crimes, not supernatural occurrences, but they couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that something unexplainable had happened. 3 weeks after the wedding, a fisherman was checking his nets in the river at the edge of Enugu when he found something caught in the water plants. It was a veil, long and white and expensive looking, the same veil that Adayes had worn, but it wasn't white anymore. The fabric had turned gray, as if it had aged decades in just 3 weeks. The lace was brittle, crumbling at the edges, and when police had it analyzed, they found something that made no sense. The DNA on the veil didn't belong to Adayes. It belonged to Mrs. Chioma, the mother. But Mrs. Chioma had never touched the veil, had never even been in the same room with it before the wedding day. How was her DNA all over it? The priest, Father Emmanuel, who'd performed the ceremony, resigned from his position 2 days after the wedding. He'd served at Crystal Cathedral for 15 years, where it was respected and loved by the community, had performed hundreds of weddings without incident. But after a diocese ceremony, he refused to explain what had happened, refused to discuss it with anyone. He left a handwritten note for the bishop that simply said, "I cannot unsee what I have seen. I cannot speak words over people when I don't know who is listening." He moved to a monastery in the east, took a vow of silence, and never performed another wedding. Detectives found one more piece of evidence that changed everything. Tobena's phone was discovered in a drawer in the church's preparation room, hidden beneath some altar cloths. When they accessed it, they found it was full of messages from an unknown number saved only as the first wife. The messages went back months, long before Tobena had met Adayez. They were written in a mix of English and what looked like Old Igbo, the kind that's barely spoken anymore. The messages talked about a debt that needed to be paid, about a ceremony that had been left incomplete, about someone who'd been waiting for decades to finish what was started. The last message, sent just hours before the wedding, said simply, "Today I will wear white again. Today I will say the words that were stolen from me. Thank you for being my vessel." Police tried to trace the number and found it had been disconnected for 25 years. 6 months after the wedding, Mrs. Chioma finally agreed to speak publicly about what she'd seen. She gave one interview to a local journalist, and what she revealed was both heartbreaking and terrifying. She explained that in the weeks before the wedding, her dreams had intensified to the point where she could barely sleep. In the final dream she had, the night before the ceremony, she'd seen a woman in a wedding dress standing by a river. The woman's back was turned, but when she turned around, Mrs. Chioma saw it wasn't a woman at all, but something wearing a woman's shape. The figure had reached up and removed its face like a mask, revealing beneath it another face, and then another, and another, layers of faces that never ended. When Mrs. Chioma woke up, she was certain something terrible was going to happen, but she didn't know how to stop it. On the wedding day, when the veil slipped and she saw her daughter's face, Mrs. Chioma finally understood what she'd been seeing in her dreams. It wasn't Adayez looking out from behind those eyes. It was something else, something that had borrowed her daughter's body for a purpose Mrs. Chioma couldn't fully comprehend. She described the eyes as empty, not in the sense of being blind, but empty in the sense of being windows to a room with nobody inside. But here's what Mrs. Chioma revealed that changed everyone's understanding of the story. She explained that the ceremony they'd witnessed wasn't a wedding at all, though it had looked like one. It was a completion, an ancient ritual that had been left unfinished decades ago, and was now being resolved using Adayez and Tobena as vessels. She'd learned this from a traditional priest she'd consulted in desperation after her daughter's disappearance, a man who dealt with things that existed in the space between the living world and whatever comes after. This priest, who didn't want his name used, explained to Mrs. Chioma what he believed had happened. In some parts of Igbo tradition, when a person dies before completing certain life rituals, particularly marriage, their spirit cannot rest. They remain in a state of incompletion, trapped between worlds, unable to move forward. Sometimes, if the circumstances are right and the spirit is strong enough or angry enough, they can reach back into the living world and finish what was left undone. They do this by borrowing bodies, by wearing the living like clothes, using them to complete the ceremony that will finally free them. The priest believed that Tobena wasn't a man at all, but a spirit that had been trapped for years, possibly decades, waiting for the right moment and the right person to help him complete his interrupted wedding. And Adayez, being sensitive in ways she might not have even realized, being the daughter of a spiritually aware mother, had been the perfect vessel. The ceremony at Crystal Cathedral hadn't married Adayez and Tobena. It had married two spirits using their bodies, completing a vow that had been broken long ago, allowing both spirits to finally move on, which meant that Adayez, the real Adayez, had been gone long before the wedding day. Probably weeks before, probably around the time her friends and family started noticing she seemed different. The thing that had walked down that aisle, wearing her face and her dress, wasn't her at all. This explanation was too much for most people to accept. The police certainly didn't include it in their official reports. The media treated it as superstitious nonsense, from a grieving mother trying to make sense of the senseless. But among the older people in the community, among those who still remembered the old ways and the old stories, the explanation made perfect sense. They'd seen things like this before, heard about them from their grandparents, knew that the world was stranger and deeper than modern education would admit. 3 months after Mrs. Chioma's interview, something happened that gave her story credibility in unexpected ways. A historian researching local records discovered documents from 1971, 54 years earlier, about a wedding that had been violently interrupted in an Igbo village not far from Enugu. A young man named Tobena and his bride had been at their traditional ceremony when the groom's father, who'd opposed the marriage, had attacked them with a machete. The groom had died instantly. The bride had survived but gone mad, spending the rest of her short life in a psychiatric facility, claiming she could see her dead fiancé standing beside her bed every night, waiting for her to say the words that would make them husband and wife. The names in those historical documents matched perfectly with the names used in Adaeza's wedding. The description of Tobena from witnesses in 1971 matched exactly with how Adaeza's Tobena had looked. Even the veil, when compared to photographs from the historical wedding, was identical in its unusual design. It was as if someone or something had been repeating the same ceremony across decades, trying again and again to complete it, using different bodies each time until finally succeeding. Mrs. Chioma also revealed something else in her interview that sent chills through everyone who heard it. She said that 3 days after the wedding, she'd received a phone call in the middle of the night from an unknown number. When she answered, she heard her daughter's voice, clear and calm, saying, "Mama, I'm free now. It's over. Don't look for me. I'm finally free." The call lasted less than 10 seconds before the line went dead. When Mrs. Chioma tried to call back, the number didn't exist. Voice analysts who later examined the recording Mrs. Chioma had saved couldn't confirm whether it was actually Adaeza's voice or something mimicking it with perfect accuracy. The recording had strange artifacts in it, sounds beneath the words that sounded almost like multiple voices speaking in unison, like a choir of one person. Was that really Adaeza's calling to tell her mother she was at peace? Or was it the spirit that had borrowed her body, offering comfort, or perhaps something more sinister? Nobody knows. 2 years have passed since that wedding day. The Crystal Cathedral stopped performing ceremonies for 6 months after the incident, and when they resumed, they'd implemented new rules. Every couple had to undergo extensive counseling and background checks. The church leadership brought in traditional priests to bless the building, mixing Christian prayer with older practices they previously dismissed as paganism. They've never publicly acknowledged what happened, but everyone in Enugu knows that something changed after Adaeza's wedding. Mrs. Chioma still lives in her house, but she's not the same woman. She's aged years in the space of months, her hair gone completely white, her eyes carrying a distance that suggests she's seen things others can't. She doesn't attend weddings anymore, refuses every invitation, says she can't bear to watch veils being lifted because she knows now what might be underneath. She spends most of her time in prayer and has become a person other mothers come to when they sense something wrong with their children's relationships, when dreams become too vivid to ignore, when modern explanations fail to explain the unexplainable. Last month, something happened that brought this story back into public consciousness. The Crystal Cathedral hosted another wedding, a big elaborate ceremony not unlike Adaeza's. Everything went smoothly, no power outages, no slipping veils, just a normal happy celebration. But as the ceremony was ending and the guests were taking photos, several people noticed a figure standing at the back of the church. A woman in a white wedding dress and veil, standing perfectly still in the shadows where the afternoon sunlight didn't quite reach. Most people didn't see her, were too focused on the bride and groom posing for pictures. But those who did see her said she looked familiar, though they couldn't quite place from where. One of the photographers, a young woman who'd been documenting weddings for 5 years, felt drawn to photograph the figure. She raised her camera, focused, and clicked. In that instant, the figure raised one hand slowly and waved, a gentle gesture that could have been friendly or could have been something else. Then she turned and walked deeper into the shadows until she couldn't be seen anymore. When the photographer checked her camera later, the photo showed nothing but an empty corner of the church. But in the bottom right of the image, barely visible, was a reflection in one of the church's stained glass windows. And that reflection showed a face that several people identified from the photos that had circulated after her disappearance. It looked exactly like Adaeza. So what really happened at that wedding 2 years ago? Was it a spirit completing an ancient ritual, using living bodies as vessels to finish vows that were interrupted decades earlier? Was it something darker? A predator of some kind that hunts through the spaces where the living and the dead overlap? Or is there a rational explanation that we just haven't found yet? Some elaborate scheme or psychological phenomenon that can account for everything without resorting to the supernatural? I don't have those answers. Neither do the police, who officially still list Adaeza Okonkwo and Tobena Chukwudi as missing persons, though they've long stopped actively investigating. Neither does the church, which has never issued any official statement about what happened. Neither does Mrs. Chioma, who believes her daughter is gone, but can't say for certain whether gone means dead or transformed into something else entirely. What I do know is this: the veil in a wedding ceremony serves a specific purpose in many cultures. It's meant to be a boundary, a protection, a final barrier between the bride's past and her future. When that veil is lifted, it symbolizes transition, transformation, becoming someone new. But what if that transformation is more literal than we've imagined? What if the veil doesn't just symbolize change, but actually facilitates it, creating a moment when one thing can become another, when the boundaries between different states of being become thin enough to cross? Mrs. Chioma once told that journalist something that stayed with everyone who heard it. She said that weddings are dangerous in ways people don't appreciate anymore. In the old days, before modern churches and white dresses and Instagram photos, Communities understood that marriage ceremonies were powerful, that they opened doors between worlds, that vows spoken in sacred spaces had weight beyond just legal contracts. They had protections and rituals to ensure only the right people walked through those doors. But modern weddings, she said, we've kept all the symbols and lost all the meaning. We wear veils without knowing why. We speak vows without understanding their power. We open doors without knowing what might walk through them, and sometimes something does walk through. Whether you believe Mrs. Chioma's explanation or not, whether you think this is a supernatural mystery, or an elaborate hoax, or a tragedy with a rational explanation, there's one question that should make anyone uncomfortable. If it could happen to Adayaz, a modern, educated, independent woman living in a major city in 2023, surrounded by family and friends and 300 witnesses, how do you know it couldn't happen to you? How do you know the person standing across from you at your wedding is who you think they are? How do you know that when the veil lifts, what you'll see underneath is what you're expecting? Tell me in the comments what you think happened that day. Do you believe Mrs. Chioma's story about spirits completing an ancient ritual? Do you think there's a rational explanation for everything? Have you ever been to a wedding where something felt wrong, where you couldn't shake the feeling that you were witnessing something you weren't meant to see? And here's the question that really matters. If you were in that church that day, if you'd seen what Mrs. Chioma saw when that veil slipped, what would you have done? Would you have stopped the ceremony? Would you have convinced yourself you were seeing things? Would you have walked out, or would you have stayed silent like everyone else and watched it all unfold? I'm reading every single comment, and I want to hear your theories, your own experiences with weddings that felt off, anything you've seen that modern explanations can't quite account for. Some of you watching this might have been to Nigerian weddings, might understand the cultural context in a way that gives you insight others won't have. Share that knowledge. Help us understand what might have happened. If this story affected you, if it made you think about the traditions we follow without understanding them, share this video. Not just for the algorithm or the views, but because somewhere out there, someone might need to hear this warning. Someone might be planning a wedding right now and sensing that something isn't right, but dismissing those feelings as cold feet or anxiety. This story might help them trust their instincts. And if you want to hear what happened to the priest, Father Emmanuel, who resigned after the ceremony and hasn't spoken publicly in 2 years, our next video will feature an exclusive conversation we finally managed to arrange with him. What he'll reveal about what he saw that day, about why he could never perform another wedding, will change how you think about every ceremony you've ever attended. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. Until then, pay attention to what happens at weddings. Watch the faces when veils are lifted. Listen to what your instincts tell you when something feels wrong. Because sometimes, in those moments of transition and transformation, in those sacred spaces where vows are spoken and futures are sealed, the veil between this world and others grows thin. And when it does, you never know what might slip through. This has been the story of the bride whose veil slipped, of the mother who saw what was underneath, and of a wedding ceremony that might have been something else entirely. Thank you for watching, and remember, some truths, once seen, can never be unseen.